At Intuit, we believe you cannot have prosperity without equality. Women and people of color should not be paid less than men for the same work. 3 years ago, we made a commitment to reach and maintain pay equity for our employees. But pay equity is an ongoing process, and all companies must join this fight. Like the 19th Amendment, we are not done.
Hi, ladies. Thank you so much for joining us today at WTF. We have a lot of ground to cover. As you know, it's been a wild several months in the land of journalism. I first just want to introduce each of you. We have Emily Ramshaw, co-founder and CEO of the 19th, which just launched and had an amazing event of their own just recently. We have Alyson Shontell, editor-in-chief of Business Insider, and we have Mitra Kalita, senior VP for news, opinion, and programming for CNN Digital. So great expertise from all different areas of journalism. So I think it's going to be really exciting, and I really appreciate you guys doing this today virtually. Just to start out, Emily, I was actually thinking maybe we should start out talking about, the 19th and kind of what it is for some people who might not know it, and kind of why you launched it and the ideas behind it.
Sure. So we just launched the 19th a couple of weeks ago. It is what we hope is the nation's first nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom at the intersection of gender, politics, and policy. So I am standing on the shoulders of these incredible women who are on the screen with me right now. But our aim really is to elevate the voices primarily of women of color and other underserved women in American media with journalism that's entirely free to consume and entirely free to republish. So that's a little bit about us.
And can you talk a little bit about how it's funded?
Sure. Our business model is, I like to call it an entrepreneurial nonprofit. So it's 5 primary buckets of revenue, and those are corporate underwriting, foundation support, philanthropic support, live events, which, as you all know, have pivoted to virtual. So there's still sort of a question mark in this moment. But then finally, it's membership, sort of the viewers like you model, people who donate $19 or $190 a year, depending on their ability to give.
Great. So that's a great place to start. Maybe we can start this question with you about, okay, you launched this amazing publication in the middle of a pandemic. Can you talk about how you had to change your plans for starting it and like the pivots you had to make?
Yeah, I think I probably was on the phone with Mitra in tears at the halfway point of this. There was, I've been fundraising like crazy basically for the last 18 months nonstop. And there was a moment in March where my husband had COVID and I was on fundraising calls, like trying to shove my 4-year-old daughter out of the screen. And we honestly stopped and we were like, are we going to be able to do this at all? Should we just wait a whole year and wait for the corporate market to rebound, wait for philanthropy to really rebound? But then honestly, it felt like this moment in history felt too important, particularly for the ways that women are disproportionately affected in virtually every arena other than mortality rates. So we just took the leap. Look, like this was always going to be a risk. It's a much bigger risk now than it probably would have been if we were launching this 2 years ago, but the timing just felt right. So ask me about my stomach acid 6 months from now or a year from now. Hopefully we still have the wheels turning here, but it's been totally unreal.
What changes did you have to make to your launch plan as a result of everything?
We didn't hire as many people as we had intended to hire. We were supposed to have a live in-person event that was supposed to be a pretty big moneymaker for us from a corporate underwriting standpoint. That event had to totally change gears. The corporate underwriting shifted. So we did a lot of sort of early belt tightening. The good news was we hadn't hired our full team yet. We didn't have to make any cutbacks, but we definitely had sort of a slower roll, a slower burn launch than we had anticipated.
And in terms of that event, can you just talk a little bit about what you anticipated and what it ended up being?
Yeah, this is the craziest part of all of this, is like this weird turning lemons into lemonade. Like we had expected we were going to have a live event in Philadelphia, our inaugural summit with, we were hoping maybe we had 1,000 people in the room and some pretty big name speakers. as a result of pivoting virtual, suddenly we were able to get names participating that we like never would have dreamed of. I will forever be beholden to Meryl Streep, because once Meryl Streep said yes, everyone else started saying yes. That is like my best business advice for anyone, is get Meryl Streep to say yes to you for anything. And by the end of all of this, we capped off this week of programming with Meghan Markle joining the mix. We had 190,000 individual people tune in over the course of that week, which is a far cry from the 1,000 we had been hoping for in the room. So it's been wild.
That's amazing. Alyson, maybe you can talk about kind of how has Business Insider had to pivot its strategy, and what changes have you had to make as a result of COVID?
Yeah, I mean, first off, Emily, huge kudos to you for launching in a pandemic and all the success you've had to date. That's incredible. BI, we had really ambitious plans at the beginning of the year. I think we wanted to bring on 80 journalists was the plan. COVID hit and we said, okay, let's just take a breath, not stop hiring, but let's see how things play out a little bit, make sure the business is still healthy and in check. After we felt like we had our footing still, then we progressed with hiring. And, will we bring on 80 this year? Probably not quite that many, but we are still hiring a lot. I think we have 30 open editorial positions right now. So the way we do a lot of our hiring is we kind of come up with a plan. We test for positions and beats that we think will work ahead of time. And then once we start to see sort of proof of concept, whether we've had a fellow or an intern on the beat, or we've had a freelancer try a beat, then we feel the confidence to hire for it. And so that's sort of what we're actioning right now.
Has it created any new beats for you because of COVID?
Oh, I mean, the news cycle has just changed everything. And it's also, everything. It's very hard to plan. And we were talking earlier before this call started about what an insane news day and news cycle it's been. So you kind of wake up not exactly knowing what your day is going to be half the time, or something broke overnight that you've got to get caught up. And we've really been impressed about the desks have all sort of come together. So, we have full newsroom collaboration on COVID. I think we've published 13,000 articles plus on the coronavirus. We're gearing up to do similar for the election. But yeah, it's changed everything we cover and everything we do. And the readership, though, thankfully is there for it. There's never been a better time to be in digital publishing for that reason, because people need information just more than ever right now.
Yeah. Mitra, what about at CNN?
I would echo a lot of what both these ladies are saying, because whether you're a startup or you're a legacy company, as CNN is, the pandemic has represented the end of business as usual. And so I would say the first significant change was the health and safety of our employees, right? And I don't mean that as a change, because that, of course, has always come first for CNN. And in some ways, we benefit from an infrastructure where the health and safety of employees was often more through the lens of folks out in the field in war zones and so forth. But that same mindset of, are our people safe? Can they work from home? What is their setup? These are very basic questions, but honestly, in those early days, they were the most important questions. And I don't think it was above any manager to have to inquire about, are you able to execute your job from home? Do you have the appropriate screen or screens? And then it sort of gets into chairs and desks and other things. But I really think the management hurdle in those early days, for me, but for many of my colleagues, was to lead with compassion and really, this was just a moment to kind of get in it with teams and make sure that we were equipped to cover this story. From a content perspective, I think there's nothing like living the story as you're covering the story. And so you mentioned the teams that I oversee. I run the National News Desk, which is basically all coverage outside of Washington, D.C., and the travel, style, wellness, science teams, right? And this is not the election year we anticipated. So, if it were a normal year, those teams, while they would definitely be producing content, it would be a different type of content than we're in the business of right now. And that pivot, I think, is significant because this really did catch us in an election year where our priorities were very different. And some people call it, service journalism, solutions journalism, public journalism, kind of this news you can use. The utility journalism is another word that I've heard. Those teams I just mentioned were so well positioned to pivot. And I just think it's good journalism, right? Because we literally have users who every day are waking up and trying to make life or death decisions. And so it's not above us or for these journalists to, explain what we mean by social distancing, or if we're talking about being outdoors, how do you position your beach blanket outside? And then of course, like the decisions that so many of us are grappling with around sending our children to school. And so there was this intentional walking our users through information that remains. And then another thing I would say is that our TV and digital integration focused on questions from users. And we just, CNN is in everybody's living rooms, it's on everybody's phones. So we're already a pretty intimate brand, but we really leaned into that to kind of ask users, tell us what you're trying to get through right now. And we've gotten tens and thousands of responses around that effort for months now.
That's great. That's great. I mean, what a good time to have that dialogue with your readers. I'm just curious. I mean, when you're trying to decide what information to share with folks, like I remember personally thinking like on the same day, I would read two separate articles from two separate outlets saying opposite things. How did you balance that?
Well, I think it's also an acknowledgement that things are changing very quickly. And so one of the lessons of digital that I know you ladies share has been it's as important for us to tell users what we don't know as what we do know. And so I think just transparency in our copy about that. Our health and science teams are pretty exacting on the studies that we will carry. And I think that's never been more important. And I would say I was pretty involved also in explaining things like trials and even studies themselves and the nature of medical publishing. I think those are actually opportunities for us to explain to users this murky world where, if you all think about it, like we've just been publishing studies on health, for forever. I mean, that's, yeah. But medical publishing itself has been upended by this. And in the hunger for information, I think it's on us to make sure we explain, this is the study, it did not follow the standards, and then you sort of outline how that works. Now, you might say, well, people take away headlines, and my hope is that people also stick with us through the nuance, because if there was ever a time to embrace nuance, I would say it would be COVID. I mean, this story necessitates it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that too is just like the information from credible sources has changed and been kind of being figured out in real time. The CDC, if you'll remember, initially said don't get face masks, like don't buy them, don't use them, and of course now we all need them. You should be able to trust the CDC. You have the government saying, oh, coronavirus isn't going to be that a big deal, it's just a media hype scene, and it's a huge deal. So things that you should be able to trust are really being called into question throughout all this. And as journalists, we have to really use our best judgment and really do the work to tell it to readers in real time as we can figure it out.
I mean, to that point, I think one of the big issues we all struggle with is this huge mistrust of the media. And I'm interested in kind of how you each have confronted that. Alyson, maybe do you want to start?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. I mean, mistrust has never been higher. I think, even back before the pandemic, Edelman came out with their 2020 trust barometer, and it was showing that trust in media is totally tanked, trust in the government tanked, trust in corporations is up, which is actually why I think you see a lot of sort of employee activism and people trying to make their workplaces better. I think people think that their companies can handle social situations better than almost any other outlet out there. For the media, it makes tremendous amount of work for us because information, like I said, has never been more important, but the mistrust has never been higher. So part of it is, I think you have to just keep educating readers about how you know what you know, how journalism works. the sources without like giving away sources, how you know that they're credible, and just detailing as much as you can for a reader to be as transparent about the journalism process as possible. And also just reputation matters for both the brand that you work for and for yourself as a journalist. I think that's why you see a lot of journalists going off on their own, trying to start their own Substacks and things, because their reputation has built up cred and people are looking for people to trust. So I think, for both the reporter themselves and the brand, everything you write and do matters more than ever.
Look, I mean, representation matters too, and allowing people to see themselves reflected in the journalism that's produced is really important. I mean, I think if you look at the subsets of people who deeply mistrust the media, I think there's an overrepresentation there of people of color who feel like they haven't seen themselves reflected or appreciated by legacy media, or it's people in sort of, what the legacy media likes to refer to as like flyover country. What you see, political reporters sort of sweeping into a diner in Ohio and thinking that they have reached conservative readers, conservative voters. I mean, I think I thought about that a lot at the Texas Tribune, where I spent the last 10 years, which is, we were based in Austin, in this very, liberal community in a deeply conservative state. I was covering one of the most conservative state legislatures in the country, and trying to find ways to connect with people who share very different views. I'm thinking about that a lot in this news space at the 19th, where like I'm, a white woman of privilege sitting here talking to you, but I have the opportunity and the luxury, honestly, of building a newsroom from the ground floor where, 80% of our journalists are people of color and other underserved minorities. And it's been a fascinating learning curve for me as we talk about trust in media. I historically, I think, thought about trust in media through the lens of people on the right who don't trust media. And now I'm thinking about it through a totally different lens, which is particularly women of color who, you look at the coverage in Kenosha, for example. I mean, and the drumbeat, I think, from so many people is, where is this disconnect between what we're reading and how we feel on the ground? And so that's it's a really beautiful place to get to explore, but it's also a deeply challenging moment for our industry.
I wouldn't have much more to add to, I think both of those answers are 100% aligned with that. I do think from the mistrust, one drumbeat I've been on is, how are we visually telling this story, right? How are we making a disease or virus rather personal? And so some of it has been our work getting into hospitals, for example, right? To really show you what otherwise you would not see. So the idea of media representing access, I think, is an important dimension of debunking mistrust through show, don't tell. And then the second piece, which I've actually done some of these myself, are just, who are the victims of this and what are the portraits of intimacy and humanity that we can convey. And I share that because I think when we talk about mistrust, it tends to be almost through the lens of fact checks and this is wrong and this is right, which we 100% do and rely on that truth squatting. But I think there's also allow me to see my father, my cousin, my husband in this. And I've written some of these obits of COVID victims, partly because I felt like, as journalists, we need to bring this to life. And I wanted to, and you guys know this, you get to a certain level in management and you're actually removed from the story, right? So we're directing coverage. And for me, like the process of confirming a COVID death, which in those early days, as you know, like the tests might come in after somebody had passed, or the medical examiner has the right to say this is COVID, even if we're not sure. It's very complicated. And I think it was important that as newsroom leaders, we understand that complicated, nuanced nature of it. So I just sort of dived into that as a way of, if I can understand it, I can help direct coverage and hopefully along the way gain more trust versus debunking as the strategy.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think one of the issues that we also wrestle with is the fact that social media has become a huge source of news gathering for some, a source of information for our readers and viewers. And it's kind of this fine line of, how do you manage that given the mistrust and inaccurate information that is on so many of these platforms. And especially with some of our staff who tend to be, this could be their first time in journalism. Can you talk about, Mitra, you want to start with that?
That's exactly what I'm getting at, right? So that there's so much of navigating, this is a new era of even navigating reporting, right? Because as much as we talk about the rights of the people who we interview, right? I've covered immigration, for example, for much of my career. And this has been a theme, and the safety of the people we interview. This is a new dimension, right? Of keeping people safe, our own staffers, as well as those who we are interviewing. And yet the burden and the opportunity to tell those stories is great. So I think for younger reporters, I was a cub reporter right after 9/11, and it shaped my entire career, right? I do not think I would be caring about the issues I care about in the newsroom. I don't think I would have been able to lead with compassion, for example, if I had not lived through essentially a trauma and had to report on it in the process. And I think there's a version of that that we're going through in real time right now. So it's interesting because some of the lessons of journalism are also, I think it's actually a good time to rip some of them up and say, well, for example, do we want, the police blotter to set our news agenda every day? Well, that's being rethought, right? Do we say just because someone was photographed or talking to us in a public place, it's fair game? So I think this is as complicated as this is, and the lessons that I've relied on for 20 years to guide the journalism, so much of that is being rethought. And I think it's also all coming to a head, which is not a coincidence.
Interesting. Alyson, what do you think?
Yeah, look, social media and the way information spreads has changed everything. We ran a Gen Z survey a year ago and found that so many of them find the top news on Instagram. Just like that's their homepage now for many people, which is just sort of wild to think about for us older millennials, I guess, and generations. So it's all changing really fast. I think one thing that we try and do as best we can is just emotions are so heightened right now, and it's like we just try and be as neutral as we can. And part of that is just like it's praising things when they deserve to be praised and criticizing things when they deserve to be criticized, but not ignoring news that doesn't fit your personal belief system. Like as best we can, we try and like wash that from the newsroom. But it's hard because emotions are incredibly heightened right now, as they should be. It's a really divisive time in the country. And, there's a lot of people who, there's a lot of feelings go around. And so the best you can, you just have to like keep trying to find both sides of the coin and reporting on both. And, I think that does help some of the social media trust if people are seeing your articles as fair as best that they can. If you're just reporting on one side, it gets harder. It's a challenge, and the algorithms just need to change. It's crazy.
Yeah, no, I think that's really true. One thing I'm also, Emily, you brought up this interesting point. We're all talking about diversity, right? And the need for more diversity, particularly in our newsrooms. And Emily, I hadn't thought about it this way, but this idea that that more diverse newsrooms will probably help you with the mistrust issue of the media. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Obviously that's a big part of the 19th.
I just think that people want to see themselves reflected in the coverage that they're consuming. And I think, what Alyson said about, trying to make sure we're doing the absolute best job to cover both sides of an issue when both sides are equally, fact and evidence based. I think, one thing that we're grappling with, I think in this moment is a lot of us who sort of grew up in this historical, I don't count as a millennial. I'm actually a little bit older than that. And I think, as we think about the ways we were sort of raised in this industry, you know, there is a real sort of generational change afoot in American newsrooms. And I think I'm being challenged on a lot of the things that I sort of held true, you know, on getting both sides of the story. Well, like, what if one side of the story is just factually inaccurate? You know, what if it's not rooted in science? What if it's not rooted in evidence? Like, is it, you know, we don't do both sidesism for both sidesism's sake anymore. And I think that's been sort of a cultural shift for a lot of people leading newsrooms. But this is honestly a fascinating moment. Like, in many ways, I feel really lucky that we are living through this moment in American media. It's uncomfortable. Like, there are a lot of conversations where I feel my stomach turn over and I'm not sure if I'm doing the right thing or saying the right thing. But I do think this is such an opportunity for us, as Mitra was saying, to sort of watch newsrooms change around us and figure out what our role is in this really sort of seismic shift that's taking place.
Absolutely. Alyson and Mitra, maybe can you talk a little bit more about, how what you're doing about making your newsrooms more diverse? I mean, Mitra, I'm particularly interested from your perspective. You've had change in leadership at the parent company, Warner Media and AT&T. This has been a huge issue throughout the company. Is it changing at CNN? You know, what kind of teeth is being put into these efforts?
So, I think anyone who knows me knows that, you know, this has been, I don't think this latest moment is when I first started speaking about these issues at CNN, right? Since the minute I've walked in, I feel like I've engaged with all levels of leadership, both our parent company as well as at CNN. And I think there's a few things that we've done right, and there's a lot of work still to do. I think, to Emily's point about generational shifts in how we approach our journalism, I think one great thing that Jeff Zucker did is meeting with small groups of people across generations to get that perspective, right? Because we often view diversity and we say, well, we have one on this team of 5, we're good, let's move on to the next one, right? And true diversity actually embraces this notion that you and I might be diverse candidates and yet have completely different points of view or perspectives on how we should approach this story, right? Or approach a certain policy. And so I think just being cognizant of that, and also recognizing that journalism, if we do it right, is a process of evolution versus something that's carved in stone in how I learned about it in J school, and therefore that's how it's always going to be. And I think there's been a lot of re-examining and almost elasticity around that, guided by a commitment to truth, facts, and representation. And knowing that representation and the number of perspectives you get make our business better and make our stories better. And then to the point of what Emily was saying, if people see themselves, then is this an audience-centric strategy? Of course, right? We are launching a race team, and I think that's important because we've always covered race, and some of the best work, I would argue, during Minnesota was from correspondents like Sarah Seidner interviewing the police chief as the family of George Floyd was on the phone. I mean, these are, you know, we've really, and she's a great example of someone who's covered race for much of her time at CNN. But how can we be more intentional about this moment in the country and force the lens on so many other issues? And I would argue COVID is another one of them. So we have job openings. I do feel the need to plug that. We're hiring for that. And then I think it just keeps coming back to, you know, I always tell journalists, like, before you fix the newsroom, you need to fix your living room, right? Like, how are you living your lives that embodies this notion of being anti-racist? Because it's not just going to start at 9 a.m. and end at 5 p.m., right? So what are you reading? What are you buying for your children? Where are you sending your children to school? Where do you live? Are you ordering pizza for that meeting? Or could we finally get some Thai food or something, right? So I think there's another dimension that journalists seem ready to engage on, to not just shift our newsrooms, but to shift ourselves and hopefully our audience as an extension of this, to finally fix this damn thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Alyson, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, it's been top of mind for the company, certainly in recent months, and an active conversation, but really just in recent months, we've realized we need to do a lot, and we need to do a lot more, and taking ownership of that. We admittedly are better in some areas than others. Like BI leadership is primarily women versus men, so that's good, nice. We fall short in other areas, and we need to do a lot better. So we've done things like we're bringing on a managing editor to specifically focus on diversity in our newsroom, things like that. I'm hopeful that just like journalism as an industry is not as diverse as it needs to be. Part of that is because a lot of the orgs are based on the coast, and living on the coast is actually privileged. The starting salaries being so low, you usually have to come from some privilege in order to make it in the industry. There's a lot of that going on that needs to be changed too. So maybe remote work can help balance that a little bit. That would be really nice, a nice outcome of this. But we also, one thing we found is we've put out a pay equity study in the middle of the last few months, which was a difficult thing to do because it wasn't as flattering as it should have been. But we did it because we need to hold ourselves accountable. And if you don't know where you are, then you don't know where you need to go. So we published that. It was not the best. We found that BIPOC women need to be paid significantly more at the company. We need more in leadership. That was a hard thing to put pen to paper and show to the company, and ultimately publicly. It leaked, and we expected it to. But it'll hold us accountable for, okay, we know we have work to do. Let's go do that work and make it so that next year it gets better and better and better over time. And I think it's important to be honest about your shortcomings, and that's really the only way that it's going to get better.
Yeah, that's a good point. I want to shift gears just with one more question, because it wouldn't be the information if I didn't ask you about what you think about paywalls and the subscription model. So, obviously a lot of publications have added the subscription model to their sites, and I'm just added paywalls, and I'm just interested from you guys. I mean, at some point, is it too many? Like, how do you see this evolving between subscription versus advertising? Alyson, do you want to start?
Yeah. So I like both. I don't think it has to be either or. For Business Insider, we spent the first 10 years of the company trying to become the biggest business site that we possibly could. I think we achieved a lot of scale. And now for the past few years, we've been really focused on building a subscription layer on top. It's probably the reverse of what you guys are doing at The Information. Both models are interesting and I think are finding success. But I do think that programmatic advertising is a nice business, and so is direct advertising when you can have it. And then if you layer on subscription and you can control a bit more of your own destiny that way, awesome. Diverse business models are great. So that's the world we want to live in.
So I would say it's easy to look at CNN.com and say, well, you're the biggest free site in the world, right? Or you could say, or you're the biggest subscription play in the world, with of course, cable television being sort of the original subscription model, right? And I think if you were to ask people who are not yet cord cutters, what are the top 10 cable channels that you subscribe to cable for? My belief would be CNN would be on that list, right? Because we fashion news as a utility. So I am similarly with Alyson on, there's a way to have your cake and eat it too, right? You create something of value, you create something that feels needed, and people are willing to pay for it. Now, is it in a bundled fashion as cable once represented, or is it many, many in-depth niche websites and users kind of self-identify? I think one thing that I've been stressing as Warner Media, our parent company, is also shifting to direct-to-consumer, and of course HBO Max and the focus around that. I think there's two things to keep in mind. One is, are you creating content of value, right? Are you shifting the content strategy in accordance with subscription, or are you just putting up a paywall and hoping that some fraction will pay for it? I think that's not a good strategy. And the second is, how are we building community, right? How are we not just making this a transactional relationship where you pay us and we provide you information, but actually you're trying to be a part of something that's greater than our brand, greater than you, and you know, something bigger is being created here. And I think that's another part of subscription that we don't really get to, whereas the platforms, I think, have understood that.
Great. I feel like you're giving us a little bit of a hint of what might be to come for Seattle Digital. We're out of time, so I'm going to have to open this up now for questions. But thank you so much, you guys. I really appreciate it. This has been a really interesting conversation.
So fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, guys. Well, thank you so much for this. It's such an interesting group of women and so interesting to hear about everything going on right now. And there's just so much going on in the news and we have a million questions. So I just want to kind of jump right into it. One question I thought was fascinating was from Regina. She's asking, you know, given the increase in control of editors over revenue in the digital, you know, world, how do you consider revenue generation to be part of your remit? Alyson, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So we are in the business of sustainable journalism. If we have no revenue, we cannot bring you any great stories that you need. So it is incredibly important. The job of an editor traditionally is not to worry about the revenue side. And we do focus on the stories, but we are also figuring out, like, okay, how do we make this a sustainable model? And so we've gone to great pains over the last few years to launch subscriptions and to do events and to diversify our revenue model as a company. And then part of that does touch the editorial mission. Like, as you're building a subscription business, by the way, that allows you to do different kinds of journalism. So how can you go deeper into business with that? So it is all related. And I think kind of gone are the days where an editor can just be an editor and not care at all if the business is making money. Digital media and just the media landscape in general has changed so much over the last 10 years that if you think you've got something down, in 6 months it'll change. And so you constantly need to be keeping up with not just the story-eyed generations, but you need to really understand what's happening in the media landscape. So I fully understand how the media industry works. I think that's highly important for any editor today. You know, we still are focused on doing the best journalism we can, but also sustainably.
I would just add to that even in the nonprofit space, there's an element of that as well. You know, I've seen sort of historically in nonprofit newsrooms, when editors want to do particular things, let's say they want to bring on an additional reporter to cover a particular area, they've gotten really crafty about seeking grant funding to make that a possibility, or to sort of thinking through the ways in which there might be new products that allow us to bring aboard additional editorial resources. So it's becoming, I think, more creative and more of a team effort in the nonprofit space too.
Mitra, do you have anything to add to that? I mean, I guess one of my questions is, obviously we have to be more aware of revenue, but how do you also have to separate church from state, right? You know, editorial coverage and, you know, marketing and advertising in the business.
So I think that the place they meet tends to be with audience. And so if both sides of what you're describing in the proverbial church and state can focus on the end user and doing the right thing by the end user, then I think we're at least aligned around the mission and the balance between revenue and editorial. And I would argue audience is the third leg and probably the most important one in that equal to maintain equilibrium, and also to be guided by doing the right thing. And in my experience, I would say over the last 10 years, the allergy that each side has to the other, like very few conversations around that. I feel like everybody is aware of the need to work together to create, as Alyson just said, sustainable businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question that came in that I thought was interesting from Alice is, how are you guys thinking about good news these days? Like, do you find it, like, is it appropriate to report on good, lighter stories in this world where, you know, people are getting laid off and sick and everything? Emily, you want to start there?
I was going to say, I think Mitra might have a better answer for this, but I mean, I absolutely think there's a place for, I don't know if you want to call it good news, but news that inspires, news that highlights people who are doing extraordinary things to help us endure this moment in history, to help us come out on the other side. So I absolutely think there's a place for good news. I think, you know, maybe good is in the eye of the beholder, but I don't know, Mitra, I mean, CNN does some lighter fare, provides some lighter fare.
So we have a newsletter called The Good Stuff that just consistently through the pandemic, subscription rates have been soaring. Its open rates remain like among our highest of our newsletter products. And I don't think that's coincidental. It comes out on Saturday morning, and I think people are really looking for a pick-me-up. I would also caution against dividing news into this bad or good category, because I think, especially during a pandemic, our role is to uplift, right? Our role is to help you get to the other side. And some of that is, how do I live my life? But some of that is in the middle of all the crazy, there is joy, there is beauty, there is life, and there is light, right? And I think that's just as important for us to make and bake into our missions as we're setting our news agenda every morning, as making sure that your feeds when you're doom scrolling are adequately populated.
Yeah, absolutely. Alyson, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this from the business perspective, just because I think it could be interpreted as insensitive if you have like a light, puffy business story about, you know, whatever, bankers on Wall Street doing something silly during all of this. So I'm interested in how you think about it.
Yeah, like I don't think you want to sugarcoat news, and we do need to tell it straight. And if the pandemic is a huge problem, you need to know it's a huge problem. It's not media hype, you know, like we have to tell those stories. But we do try and look for silver lining. So when the pandemic first started, one example is, I said in the newsroom, let's go find Zoom influencers. Who are people who are reinventing themselves on Zoom? Give me the yoga instructor with the most people watching her show every week, and like how she went from a yoga studio to that. Or like, we wound up interviewing someone who did trivia nights in Baltimore, who used to pack bars and now packs a Zoom chat. And so like that also, like the thinking different is refreshing for readers, and it's refreshing for us as reporters. And it's important to keep doing that. So when you're covering such a negative news cycle, it really impacts you. I mean, as a writer, it's like you can feel really down and really depressed, and we need those uplifting things too. So I think it can feel overwhelming when the news cycle is as it is, and we can't sugarcoat that for you. But I do think it's an important piece to try and find those positive stories of people figuring out ways through it.
Absolutely. I remember we had a story early on about the Zoom cocktail parties, and it was very well read. People were very excited, and then now everyone does them. That's like part of our life. So another question about metrics. This is a good one. What success metrics do you look at most closely these days on both a story and enterprise-wide level? Emily, do you want to start, since you probably have been thinking about this quite a bit? Just starting off.
We're brand new, so for us, all metrics right now are good metrics. But I mean, I think, you know, obviously we're still looking at web traffic. We're looking very closely at open rates. We're looking at event attendance. But we are really seriously looking at membership. I mean, for us, honestly, the barometer of a really engaged and invested newsroom is the people who are willing to put their money where their mouth is and say, we want to be part of what you're building here. And so I would call membership probably the most critical metric for us.
I think that this is probably going to be unpopular, but I still think that page views and unique still matter, right? So I still view those as people. I always say, like, these are people. Let's not distill this into some number. So I remain committed to that metric. And yet time spent is one that we're increasingly sharing in our morning news meeting. And then the other metric that over the last year I've really been encouraging our sections to look at is the second click. So is somebody reading your content, and what's the likelihood of them clicking on another piece of content, whether it's within that vertical or on the page. And that's just, it starts to, I hope, breed our movement towards rewarding loyalty versus, a click for click's sake.
And how do you share that with your team? Does everyone see those stats?
We're pretty, so I think one of the benefits of a CNN is that television has always had ratings baked into its model, whereas newspapers, it was nobody, besides circulation, you really didn't know what people were doing with your front page stories, right? So I would say that the culture at CNN is way more on the side of putting out content and asking the question right away of how successful was this content. So it's very much in the culture of the place to share that information. I'm pretty transparent on it, but I also think that having meetings around what this means and shifting the numbers to turn into insights that inform your strategy is a really important bridge to, okay, we know, for example, that stories about entertainment seem to get a second, even third click from our users. So how do we then super serve an audience that has self-identified as wanting to be super served, right? That's a different conversation than, keeping up with the Kardashians is being canceled. Let's flood the zone with lots of stories. That's a very different conversation.
Right.
Yeah, we use data a ton as a newsroom. We always have. The great thing about digital media is you can track. And look, people are people, uniques are uniques. I completely agree with Mitra. It's still important. And by the way, our reporters sometimes have different missions. So some of them, their goal is start the dinner conversation. What they're writing should be talked about at dinners across the country or the world, and their goal is to reach lots of people and influence them with their stories. And then for others, it's to influence an industry, and you want to create a must-read for finance, and that is a completely different type of story. And by the way, a different type of success metric than that dinner table conversation goal. One is a mass appeal, and one is do the right people in the right industry and the right minds, are they talking about it? Are they reading it? And that's a much smaller audience, but a really important and engaged audience. And so we try and cater to all of that. So we look at different things to measure that. And just for transparency, we feel strongly all companies are looking at data at some level. Not everyone gives it to their employees, but someone in your company knows how things are going and have the stats. We feel that stats can be incredibly empowering. The way that sports athletes they know the stats on their games. They know when they had an awesome game, and they knew when they didn't. So this is a talent industry. So people should know, are their stories generating subscriptions if that's the goal? Are their stories getting read by enough people to drive those dinner conversations? All the data that we would have in management, pretty much the newsroom can have to look at. And it shouldn't dictate all of their story decisions, but it can help inform them and show them what people are interested in and where they can match their passions with what the audience is passionate about too.
Just sticking with that thread for a minute, for a financial story, for example, what are some of the metrics you look at for something more specific like that?
That's more subscribers. Just that it's much more of a subscriber industry. It has never been millions of people are going to read about what bankers on Wall Street are doing today. Yeah.
Right. On that, kind of along that thread as well, how do you maybe Alyson, we should start with you on this. How do you reconcile paywalls or pricing with access to informational news power for people or groups we're trying to include?
It's a great question. And I think it's something that needs to be better thought out across the industry and at our company as well. We've gone through this a lot with coronavirus, and a lot of news organizations have tackled it differently, which information should all of it be in front of the paywall? Should some of it be behind the paywall? Where we've landed is if it's you have to know it's safety related, it should be in front. But if it's more of an industry, want to know thing, then it can be behind. But kind of would people be hurt if they didn't have this information? Of course, it should be free. And so we try and do that balance on serious subjects like that. But then in terms of access to different groups and different pay structures to be more inclusive, I think there's a lot of work to do there.
Mitra, do you want to chime in on that at all?
So this is obviously an area that we're in the conversion of shifting, Warner Media company-wide to a more direct-to-consumer business, right? I've been reading up on this a lot, and I feel like watching new products like Emily's, for example, there's so clearly a sense of who their end user is. And I think that's almost where you start versus the paywall conversation, which becomes one of, pay us, we promise it'll be worth it. Or journalism is dying, please give us your money, right? So I think there's a lot of framing around what we're actually asking our users for that, for me, feels like step one of the paywall and how porous you want to make it. And I think I'll leave it there because I'd love to hear Emily's thoughts, because I feel like they focused on identifying almost like who their community and who their people are, and then you hope that the rest follows. And I that's at least the research that I've been reading in this space. That seems to be the right tactic.
For us, look, I mean, I've spent the last 10 years plus in the nonprofit space, and I really believe that we're all performing a public service, that journalism is a public service. From us and our tack, like the audience that we're going for, we don't want there to be any barrier to entry. If I want women and others who've been marginalized by their gender to be more deeply engaged in our electorate, I don't want anything to stand in their way. And so from that standpoint, a paywall wasn't an option for us. As Mitra said, we're hoping that we're building such an engaged community that they're going to support this because they believe in what we're trying to accomplish. But for us, it's making that journalism both free to consume and free to republish by every other news organization in America.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, I think it's really interesting. Obviously, we have a paywall, and our whole belief is that, if you create engaging content, people are going to be willing to pay for it. Jessica's chiming in too. That is her whole motif for the information. And right, people thought she was crazy when she launched the information, and then many publications have launched paywalls since then. I could talk to you ladies for the rest of the afternoon, but we have to move on. We have a networking break, and then we're going to have Linda Yaccarino from NBC. So thanks so much, guys, and I really appreciate it. Have a great one.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.